Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about Bob Lazar's claims about element 115 and alien technology as he describes it. I've already talked about these things before in previous videos about Lazar, but I'm going to go into a bit more detail, especially about element 115. So in 1990, he actually did an interview with somebody called Michael Lindemann, and Lindemann wrote a book called UFOs and the Alien Presence. And you can see the chapter in the book where he interviews Lazar at these links here. So from page 106, Lazar is quoted as saying, "I was the one who identified 115. That was my only contribution to the project." So supposedly Lazar is the one who first identified 115 in his story. Also, you should check out this article by Tom Mahood, which goes into some further analysis of Lazar's 115 claims. And this is just a snapshot of that interview, but it's the same text as you can find here in the other two links. So this is page 106 and 107. And I direct your attention especially to these parts. So Lazar is saying, keep in mind that when I first went out there, they had no idea what the fuel was, the fuel for the alien spacecraft. Okay. Michael asks, they had not yet identified 115. Lazar, I was the one who identified 115. That was my only contribution to the project. And I don't stand on the fact that it's 115, but if it's not, it's 114. It's right in there. So he's expressing ambiguity about whether it was really 115 and that if it wasn't, it was 114. Michael, that brings us to a question we discussed before meeting you today. We weren't sure whether 115 was a very precise nomenclature. Bob Lazar, no, it's not. I call it 115 because I've gotten used to saying that, but it's certainly right in there. Here, Michael asks, so your contribution was identifying this stuff? Lazar, yes, and there again, this confirms what I said, that this project was apparently being worked on for some time, several years, I would imagine, and they had no idea what the fuel was. We're talking about a very basic thing, certainly a reasonable starting point. So he's saying that they didn't even start from that reasonable starting point, and they basically didn't bother trying to find out what the element was until they got him in there, and he then, worked out that it was 115. Although again, he says he wasn't sure, that it might have been 114. So this story really doesn't make any sense because we're being asked to believe that the government had possession of these flying saucers and they didn't even bother finding out the element. Okay. Lazar himself says it was a very basic thing, certainly a reasonable starting point. Yet somehow they took a long time to just figure out what the element was, or they didn't even bother trying to find out. Now, people often say that Lazar was the first one to talk about element 115 or that he predicted it. Neither of those are true. Element 115, as I've shown in previous videos, was being talked and theorized about since at least as far back as the early 1970s. And it was also talked about in a 1989 Scientific American article, which I'm going to talk about. But, he also mentions here element 114. And so we might as well this is just tongue in cheek, but, let's call element 114 Robertium because he's the, quote, first one to talk about it. Now, element 115 has been synthesized, and so has fluorovium, which is element 114. These are the isotopes, okay, which have been synthesized for element 114. These are the discovery years, so when they were actually synthesized. The first one was in 1998 for this isotope, and these are the half-lives. Okay, so how long they take how long does half of a sample take to decay from the original isotope? So they've got very short half-lives. The longest half-life is 19 seconds. Of course, it's conceivable that there's isotopes with longer half-lives, maybe even a stable isotope, but we haven't discovered it yet. Now, getting onto the Scientific American article, this is from May 1989, and it was released just weeks before Lazar's story hit the news, okay, when he was interviewed by George Knapp. And this article is called Creating Super Heavy Elements, and it's written by actual physicists, okay, these guys from Germany. Now, it mentioned element 115, but it also mentioned element 114. So this is from page 66, 68, and 71. And there is the mention of element 115. Okay, now, so he mentions both of them, and this was before he came out with his story. Many of you will already know about the Scientific American article that I'm showing you here. Now, Lazar said, of course, that element 115 is stable. He said that in many interviews. This is just one example. This is from around 1994, and there's the timestamp. Now, the weird thing is, why didn't he mention the isotope back in those early interviews? Like, he mentions the element, but he doesn't mention the isotope. So isotopes differ in the number of neutrons that the atoms have got. So atoms are defined as the number of protons that the atoms have got, but they can still differ in the number of neutrons. So these are different variants of the same element. This is for element 115. Okay, these are the isotopes that have been synthesized so far. And these are the half-lives. Okay, so these have got very short half-lives. The longest half-life here is only 650 milliseconds. And again, it's conceivable that there is actually a stable version of element 115 in the universe. Lazar says that probably the aliens did not synthesize it themselves, but that they got it from a supernova remnant or from the material in their own solar system. We don't find any naturally occurring element 115 in our solar system, which is very suspicious for his claims, because the material from super heavy stars, once it gets dispersed by supernova explosions, it should pretty much go, I don't want to say equally distributed everywhere, but there should still be some element 115 if it's being produced by, heavy stars. But we don't find it in our solar system. Okay, and also, Lazar's claim is that the element was stable and came from, another star system. But how does that story get vindicated by, synthesizing a few atoms of unstable isotopes on Earth in a laboratory, when he himself says that the aliens did not get it from particle accelerators or nuclear reactions on their planet, that they must have gotten it from space or from somewhere in the solar system, in their solar system. Okay. Now, eventually the isotope was named, like the purported stable isotope. As far as I can find, it was only in the 2000s when, his website was online, his United Nuclear website. And here he sells scientific supplies and equipment, and also Area 51 and flying saucer merchandise that cashes in on his story. So here you've got this graphic, which appears on t-shirts and coffee mugs and stickers that he sells. And it's got atomic mass 299. So this is the purported stable isotope of element 115. But as far as I know, this only ever appeared in the 2000s. not in the 90s, and certainly not when he, 1989, when he first was talking about his story. So where did this 299 come from? I don't think it came from him. He probably just copied it from somewhere. So what's the provenance of this 299? Did it originate with Lazar? And if so, why didn't he mention it in the 90s in his interviews? He was saying that the scientific community deserves to know the truth and that they should have access to the technology and so on. And yet he's never stood in front of a panel of actual scientists to discuss his claims. So that's very strange for a so-called physicist to behave that way and to, reveal the isotope in merchandise that is selling on his website. If anyone knows of an earlier reference to 299, please let me know. Also remember that he couldn't stand on the fact that the element that he was looking at was 115 and that maybe it was 114 instead. And this suggests that 299 was simply copied by him later on from someone else's suggestion. In other words, it did not originate with him. Or maybe he did actually guess it, like he just made a wild guess and he's just putting it up there to sort of patch over his earlier oversight or his mistake of not talking about the isotope in the 1990s. Beneath the graphic for the t-shirt, it says element 115, commonly known as moscovium, originally ununpentium. The isotope was synthesized in 2003 and found to be unstable. Should the stable isotope ever be synthesized, some have suggested it be named Lazarium, as Lazar claimed the stable isotope existed in the late 80s, except that he never named the isotope back then, so he doesn't deserve any credit for it. Even if we did discover a stable isotope of element 115, even then he wouldn't deserve credit for it because he didn't actually come out with the information when he was saying all this stuff. There is a snapshot from or screenshot from the website, Lazarium t-shirt, $22. And it's just one example of how he's made money from his story, despite his claim that he's never made a penny from it. And he's done this in various ways since he came out with his story. I'm not going to talk so much about the financial aspect in this video, but it's something to keep in mind. Maybe gives us some insight into his motivations for his story. Now, PH is the physicist friend or the purported physicist friend of Michael Lindemann. This guy's identity, I don't think has ever been revealed, but he was part of the interview in UFOs and the Alien Presence, and he was asking Lazar some questions. This was not a formal scientific, panel interrogation by a group of scientists, and Lazar was standing in front of them or anything like that. This is an informal, chat. But PH was supposedly working for one of the top physics institutes in the United States at the time. And he's asking Lazar a few questions. So do you have to use some nuclear bombardment to produce the gravitational wave? He's asking Lazar. So the gravitational wave is a big part of the Lazar story. Supposedly element 115 produces a gravitational wave that the flying saucer then amplifies to achieve lift and to fly around. Lazar is now saying that no, you don't need to use nuclear bombardment to produce the wave. It may enhance it or amplify it to some degree or stimulate it to produce more, but just a single piece of element 115 lying on the table has a sufficient enough gravitational wave to deflect a laser fired over it. Now, this is really, really dumb because he's saying that on the table, you can just basically throw it onto a table and then you can fire a laser over it and it's going to deflect the laser. So that would require a lot of gravity to be able to do that. And so how would you even manipulate something like this and put it on a table in the first place? He's saying that unprocessed raw element 115 by itself is sufficient to do this. Okay. Also, he says in the same interview that Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he actually worked as a technician, was doing the machining. Well, he was working as a technician at Lanol. When was it? Like in the early 80s. But he says that Lanol was involved in this research and that they were machining the pieces. Okay. So we're going to see why that's nonsense as well. So here, PH is asking, how did you determine that? Did you put it in a mass spectrograph? How do you figure out what element it was? Okay, so how do you determine the element? Lazar, well, there are many different ways, but certainly a mass spectrograph was one way. We also did all kinds of bizarre things. He just leaves it at that. All kinds of bizarre things. Like, what does that actually mean? Los Alamos apparently was involved in some of the analysis of element 115, and I don't know if they knew what they were doing. Says the guy who just admitted that he doesn't know if it was 115 or 114, and who used a mass spectrograph and all kinds of bizarre things, whatever that means. Still couldn't figure out if it was 115 or 114. Okay, he's saying that other people don't know what they're doing. They were also involved in some of the machining of the pieces. How would you machine something like that with these extreme gravitational properties? Okay, powerful enough to bend light. So he says certainly a mass spectrograph was one way in 1990. Then in 1993, he kind of contradicts himself. This is during the press Q&A in Rachel, Nevada, where some journalists and UFO people are asking questions. And he was sort of the star guest at that gathering. Somebody asked him about whether he'd seen spectral analysis of element 115. And he replied, well, no, I haven't seen any spectrographic analysis on it. Or, well, actually, they did do. I don't know if I saw it, though. I wouldn't be able to identify the lines. No. Okay, you can find the timestamp for this entire, well, the entire press Q&A is available on YouTube, but this quote is timestamped here, and you can find the transcript for the entire session here. So he's saying, first of all, in 1990, that certainly a mass spectrograph was one way for determining the element. Then in 1993, he said that he can't even remember if he saw a spectrographic analysis. And even if he did, he can't identify the lines. These are just screenshots from both of those interviews. So from 1993, when he says that he can't remember and can't identify the lines, the questioner continues, you're not aware of the results? Lazar, they probably told them or showed them to me, but I can't for the life of me remember after 4 years. So even at that early stage, after telling his story, he's already, pulling out the I can't remember card, which is obviously done even more, in the past few years, like especially in the Joe Rogan Experience interview, he constantly says like, I can't remember, or I don't recall. And we see him already doing that early on. And in fact, even earlier on, like in 1990, if you actually read that chapter from the Lindemann book, you'll see that he says that a lot as well, that he can't remember certain things. And this is the guy who supposedly was called in to identify the element, okay? Because they somehow hadn't bothered doing that when they acquired the flying saucers. Then he comes in and he's supposedly a physicist. He claims that he was a physicist at Lanol, even though he wasn't, and that he was a senior staff physicist at S4. It gets even worse. This is from page 181 of another book. This is Timothy Good's Alien Contact from 93. And this conveys another interview from 1990 with Lazar. And here Lazar is explaining some things about the, how you get antimatter from the alien reactor. He mentions element 116, that when you bombard element 115 with protons, it gets kicked up to element 116. Now, how would he know that? Like, he doesn't explain how he actually figured that out. And in fact, how would he know that if he didn't even know that the original element was 115 or 114? Here he also says some other stuff like that. After it gets kicked up to 116, it releases antimatter. And then you get the annihilation reactions, and that provides power or energy for the electrical systems on the spacecraft. And I guess also to help amplify the gravitational waves. So you've got your element 115, which is by itself already emanating the gravity waves. And then the gravity amplifiers further, enhance that. So how does Mr. Physicist know that it gets kicked up to 116, yet even after mass spectroscopy and all kinds of bizarre things, he doesn't know whether the original element is 114 or 115. And the government is reputed by Lazar to possibly have 500 pounds of element 115. He says that in that interview from around 94. Okay, there's the timestamp. And that seems really bizarre, because if a piece of element 115 on a table is enough to deflect laser light, imagine what 500 pounds would do. Maybe the Earth wouldn't even survive that much material. But, you can always make a story that maybe it was shipped to Earth in separate little chunks or something like that. In any case, it doesn't really explain that. He just says that he heard it from Barry or from Dennis, his supervisor at S4, but he can't vouch for that story. Now, that aside, maybe you could sort of make a story that the gravity waves, the gravitational properties of element 115 were sort of interfering with the spectral analysis or other tests to determine what it was. And that's why he wasn't sure whether it was 114 or 115. Nope. You can perish the thought there as well, because according to Lazar, you can literally lift a small piece of element 115 and you can tell that it's much heavier than lead, right? Just by lifting it, you can tell. So he's implying that with your hand, you can lift it and you can literally tell that it's heavier than lead. So that negates element 115 having any type of magical gravitational properties. He says it's more of a burnt orange color and it is extremely soft. You can certainly make an indentation with your fingernail into it, which, why would you need to machine it if it's so soft? Maybe you could combine it with another metal to make an alloy, and then you need to machine that, but he doesn't mention that. He just says that Lanel was involved in machining the pieces of element 115. He says it's heavy. By lifting a small piece of it, you can tell it's not lead. It's amazingly heavy. So that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If it's got these amazing gravitational properties, then that's gonna, you wouldn't be able to tell that it's heavy, especially because he says that the gravity waves kind of provide like a repulsive force against the Earth's gravity. And so that makes it even more difficult to suppose that you could tell with your hand how heavy, that it's heavier than lead. So by lifting a small piece of it, you can tell it's not lead. So how did he lift it? Okay, to feel its weight. If it produces gravitational waves, according to him, sufficient to deflect light. So it's one or the other. It can't be both. And how much is a small piece? He doesn't mention that either. He does mention that the spacecraft, the sport model uses 223 grams of element 115, and that it, can use that for 30 years before the supply is depleted. But, it's not clear that that's what he means by a small piece. And also, how strong was this gravitational effect exactly? He provides a lot of claims, but he doesn't really quantify them. Continuing, in this timestamp, this is actually from the Lazar tape, the VHS tape that he sold with Gene Huff back in the day for $30. And this is a quote from that video. You can find the timestamp there. He says, generally speaking, the stability of these synthesized heavy elements decreases as their atomic number increases. But experiments in the lab for heavy ion research in Germany have shown that this may only be true up to a certain point, as the half-life for element 109 is longer than that of 108. So he's alluding to heavy elements which people are synthesizing in the laboratory. Element 115 had not yet been synthesized. That would only be in 2003, but there was already, a lot of talk in the scientific community about the synthesis of heavy elements. So that's what he's talking about here. 109 and 108 had already been synthesized. Now, here's the thing. In the Scientific American article, it also mentions 109 and 108. Okay, so I think it's pretty obvious that that's the source for his claims about element 114 and 115. Okay, and also the island of stability, which is a concept in physics. It's also alluded to in that article. Oops. So this is just another shot from that article, and it shows the it talks about the authors and that they work on the synthesis of super heavy elements at the Institute for Heavy Ion Research in Darmstadt, Germany. Okay. This is a graphic from, or a figure from the same article. And it mentions element 109, that its half-life, well, let me just highlight that. In contrast to the general trend of reduced stability with increasing atomic number, the half-life of element 109 is greater than that of 108. Okay, so this is what he's saying here, that there's a trend, there's a general trend that the stability of the synthesized heavy elements decreases as their atomic number increases. But experiments in Germany show that this may only be true up to a certain point. And then he mentions elements 109 and 108. So he's basically just regurgitating what is mentioned in this paper, in this article. So I think it's pretty obvious that this is the source for, his ideas about element 115, the mention of 114 as well, and islands of stability. So I've also mentioned previously in other videos that element 115 was being talked about, way before this. So, back in the 1970s, but probably, I think he didn't read those papers, but he almost certainly read this article in Scientific American. Okay, this is further up in the same figure. It shows 109, this isotope, which was synthesized with a half-life of 3.4 milliseconds, and then these two isotopes of 108, okay, with a shorter half-life, even though they've got a lower atomic mass. Or atomic number. Well, they've also got a lower atomic mass. So 265 and 264 is lower than 266, and 108 is lower than 109. So continuing, this gets into the nuclear explosion, the reactor blowing up from the previous scientists or technicians at S4, and then they had to pass that off as a nuclear test. So here, Michael is asking, could you actually get a nuclear explosion out of this thing? Which he means the the reactor of the craft. Lazar says, no, it's too stable, though there'd be a localized explosion because there's active antimatter in a small portion of the reactor, but not a lot. Depending at what power level the craft is operating at, I don't think there'd be very much of an explosion. And chances are, I think in a crash situation, most systems would shut down. Then Gene Huff interjects. He says, the guys that cut open the reactor did die from an explosion. Michael, yes, but that doesn't take much of an explosion, to be killed from an explosion. Gene Huff, well, he could elaborate on the explosion a little bit, how it blew the blast door off into the monitoring area. Bob Lazar, that's true. It was a good bang. I'd say in the 20 kiloton range or something like that. Michael, that big, okay. And then PH, the physicist friend, are we only talking about the sport model so far? Bob Lazar, that's the only thing I know about. So he's immediately contradicting himself when he says that it was a 20 kiloton explosion, which is a nuclear explosion equivalent. And that means 20,000 tons of TNT equivalent. So that's like a tactical nuclear bomb. Where previously he just said that you wouldn't get an explosion, a sizable explosion, because the reactor is too stable. So that's a contradiction. Also here he's saying that's the only thing I know about in reference to the sport model. So the sport model is supposedly the one he worked on, but this is implying that there was a previous sport model, okay? So that would mean that, the other workers had access to a reactor and then that blew up, and then Lazar had access to another reactor. So that raises the question, like, how is the government actually acquiring so many spacecraft? Maybe the aliens are just handing them out. Or he said that he saw 9 flying saucers at S4 in the hangar, but how would they get them? That's really strange, right? And 2 sport models. So the explosion at the Nevada test site, he says it's far too stable for a nuclear explosion. And then he says, I'd say in the 20 kiloton range for when it did explode. Also, he says, I'd say, but what does that mean? I'd say, was he actually calculating that using actual data, or was he just repeating what somebody told him? So he doesn't elaborate on that either. But he does this a lot. The way he talks, it's sort of, he implies that he calculates stuff, but then he doesn't actually explain how he calculates it or what data he was using. When he says active antimatter in a small portion of the reactor, we have to get this part really straight, because he's saying that they were cutting into a live reactor, which they'd figured out at least how to turn on, yet they didn't bother figuring out the element it was running off until he got there to S4, which doesn't make any logistical or institutional sense. So they had this thing for at least a couple of years, as he says here. Okay. He's asked, how long had they been working on the thing? Bob Lazar, it seemed like at least a couple of years. So they were working on this thing already, but they didn't work out the element. That doesn't make any sense. For more on these aspects of his claims, especially the antimatter aspect and the gravity aspects, so he talks about gravity A and B waves. Lazar does. Dr. David L. Morgan counters these claims and uses actual established physics. So he assesses Lazar's claims from the perspective of general relativity, the standard model, and so on. So that's a really good article that I recommend you check out. Now, this idea about the reactor blowing up, George Knapp mentioned it in 1989. Okay, he says there was an accident, he says, so Lazar says, back in April 87. an accident that was passed off as an unannounced nuclear test. Then Lazar has also made this claim many times that there was an explosion at the Nevada test site, and it was to be passed off as an unannounced nuclear test. You can see the timestamp there. In Timothy Good's book, Alien Contact, May 1987 is given as the rough date of the explosion instead of April. Okay. Now, there's problems with his story. There's actually many problems, but this is one of them. That the government actually never passed off anything as an unannounced nuclear test because it never happened. We actually know all the nuclear tests that happened at the Nevada test site because they were documented, and the Department of Energy released that information in the 1990s. And so we know all of the tests that happened. No unannounced nuclear tests, purported or otherwise, took place at the NTS in May 87. And the tests in April of 87, they were announced, and there were even protesters at the gates of the Nevada test site because they already knew that there were going to be tests, and they were there to protest that. These are the nuclear tests at the NTS in 87. They were part of Operations Musketeer and Touchstone, 14 and 13 separate tests, respectively, for those operations. Musketeer ran from 86 to 87. Touchstone ran from 87 into 88. This is the document released by the DOE, United States Nuclear Tests, July 1945 through September 1992. This contains all the nuclear tests ever conducted by the United States. Most of them were done underground at the Nevada test site. And here you can see you can download the PDF. This one was from December 2000, but this was an updated version of a previous one from around 98, I think. For Operation Musketeer, you've got this entry. You've got the test, the date, the sponsor, the location, and the hole where the detonation actually took place. Okay. Now, for Musketeer, it went from 86, late 86, and then into 87. So these are for February, and this one's for March. These are sponsored by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and this one's Lanel. These are Lawrence Livermore. This one's Lawrence Livermore and DOD as the sponsors. Okay, the location, all at the Nevada test site, and the hole. Some more details on those ones. You got the time of day that it happened, the latitude and longitude, the surface elevation, the type, the purpose, and the yield range. So how powerful was it? And that's the number of the actual test. Okay, continuing with Musketeer, it goes into April. So you got 3 in April. These ones were announced. Okay, so the protesters knew about these ones. Then it goes into June. There's none in May. So it couldn't have been May. It couldn't have been April either. And then in September, Musketeer ends, and then Operation Touchstone kicks off. So for the rest of 87, and then it goes into 1988. But these are just for 1987, okay? So the April ones were known about, were announced ahead of time, and there were none in May. So they couldn't have passed it off as an unannounced nuclear test because there were no unannounced nuclear tests in May. Okay, some more details about these operations. So maybe he just had the time period wrong. Maybe he meant another month. But, you know, he's never actually corrected himself as far as I know. He's never actually stuck his neck out and said this supposed test of a nuclear bomb was was actually an alien reactor exploding. Like, and he's not going to do that because that would mean that he will face backlash from actual Nevada test site employees who actually worked on these test series, right? And they can actually back up what they're saying, unlike him. For more analysis on the blown reactor story, you should check out this article by Tom Mahood. From page 113 of UFOs and the Alien Presence, the physicist asks, how much power is the reactor developing? Lazar says, a tremendous amount. I don't remember specifically. The physicist asks, megawatts? Lazar says, it was greater than megawatts. I seem to remember 100 or 200 megawatts. What does it mean, seems to remember? Like, wasn't the propulsion system his area, right? And he's giving these details about antimatter reactions and gravity wave amplifiers and element 115, but he doesn't know the actual power output. And why would he only seem to remember it? Like, it wasn't that his area of expertise that he was called in to actually, reverse engineer? Now, it gets us a bit stranger still because he actually ties his story into the Cash Landrum incident in 1980. This is a famous UFO case, and it involved Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, and Vicky's young grandson, Colby. They were driving on the road one night in December, and they saw a very bright light, and it was like a diamond-shaped UFO, and it was spitting flames from underneath and emitting a lot of heat. And it landed or was hovering in front of them on the road. They had to stop the car. It was very hot. The vinyl on the dashboard got so hot that when Landrum touched it, she left her handprint on it, and the UFO left a scorching mark on the road. And then Cash and Landrum got very sick, supposedly from the radiation from the UFO. Okay, and they had to be hospitalized. Now, Lazar tries to tap into this story. He's asked by Michael, turning the question around again, do you know how to propagate gravity waves in a controlled way? Lazar says, yes, I do. Then the physicist asks, perhaps there's a less efficient way of doing it. And then Lazar launches into the Cash Landrum case. He says, I believe there was a test using plutonium. I think this is part of the Cash Landrum case where this was actually done. And there was a large quantity of plutonium specifically for that purpose. So he's tying the gravity manipulation story, to do with a sport model into the Cash Landrum incident and saying effectively that instead of element 115, they were using plutonium. Then Michael asks, are you suggesting that the flying saucer associated, or the flying machine associated with the Cash Landrum incident, was human built, powered by plutonium, using this kind of technology? Lazar, yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting, supposedly. Now, this wasn't in documentation that I read, but I've seen it surface several times, and I believe I heard some reference to it. There is a craft buried out at Area 51 somewhere that was heavily contaminated, and I think that was another test of a plutonium-powered vehicle. But I think the amount of plutonium we're talking about is certainly a dangerous amount to be hauling around in a craft. It would be very difficult to contain, and I think it's a very inefficient inefficient fuel for what they're doing. So he's saying that the Cash Landrum case and this other craft supposedly buried at Area 51 were using plutonium, right, instead of element 115. Now, there's many problems actually with a Cash Landrum case, and I'll probably do a video about it someday. But here are just some of the problems. they reported, so they reported getting sick, right? So supposedly from the UFO because it was emitting radiation. Now, ionizing radiation would have killed them if it was sufficient to have produced the symptoms that they got so quickly, then they would have died. No burn mark on the road was ever identified. No handprint by Landrum on the supposedly heated vinyl dashboard was ever found or photographed. Cash's medical records have never been released on privacy grounds. So, I think they did actually get sick, but it doesn't prove that it was from a UFO. And since we can't access the medical records, we can't get, the needed details about that. So, it's not evidence that you can't use it as evidence that they got sick from a UFO. And they filed a ridiculous lawsuit against the government for $20 million in damages. Okay. And this may have been part of a cash grab or an opportunistic cash grab. Maybe they did see something and they interpreted that as a UFO, but then they tried to sue the government. And they also mentioned that they counted 23 Chinook type helicopters that night, which was sort of escorting the UFO. Okay. So they were using that as the basis for saying that the government knew about the UFO because it had these helicopters protecting it. However, the noise from helicopters, from that many helicopters, would surely draw attention to this flying radioactive environmental nightmare, as I call it, the Fren. It would make the UFO very conspicuous. And why are they flying it over civilian areas? That's very strange. So this case is actually very weak. It does not provide strong evidence for alien visitation or anything else like that. Lazar says it was a man-made craft, but, the case itself is very weak. Now, Lazar is tapping into UFO lore once again here. He's done that time and again. For example, with the Betty and Barney Hill case and the Zeta Reticuli reference, MJ12, Gray's, the Dulce Bay story, his claims about Magneto, or the propulsion system is reminiscent of stuff that was talked about in UFO TV specials. And he also says that his master's degree from MIT, which he can't provide any evidence for, was on the topic of magneto hydrodynamics. Okay. And gravity manipulation was also being talked a lot about in UFO TV specials from the 70s and 80s. Saucer recovery narratives. So the Roswell story had already, was becoming prominent again. And Billy Meyer beam ship, the sport model is basically a copy of a Billy Meyer dinner plate saucer. And ancient astronauts claims as well. So all of these things and much more, Lazar just copied from other stories and then assimilated into his own story to make it more compelling to the UFO crowd. So Lazar is saying that the government, it was in 1980, the Cash Landrum case, already able to fly a plutonium-powered exotic craft for some reason near civilian areas, using the same basic gravity manipulation techniques as the sport model. Yet they were screwing around at S4 by cutting into live alien reactors because no one knew any better. So that doesn't make any sense. There's also another logistical problem, which is that if the government had actually constructed such a large diamond-shaped craft, as reported in the Cash Landrum case, that would require a huge industrial infrastructure, which obviously the US does have. But then why does the government contribute so little resources in Lazar's story to reverse engineering the alien craft? He says that there's only like 22 people there working on this craft. But if you compare that to the Manhattan Project, which was to develop the first atomic bombs, that involved hundreds of thousands of people. And billions in investment. So that doesn't make any sense either. So in Lazar's story, basically nobody knows what they're doing. Not the staff at S4, not the technicians who blew themselves up by cutting into the live alien reactor, and Lanel didn't know what they were doing either. And in fact, not even Lazar knew what it was doing, because he couldn't tell if it was dealing with element 114 or 115. And yet, despite all this incompetence, according to his story, they were able to master the ability to fly the alien ships at S4. He says that he witnessed a test flight and that he brought his friends to view additional test flights, near Papoose Mountain. So Gene Huff, in this interview, here's the timestamp. He says that he witnessed like a zigzag maneuver of the craft. So that means that they had achieved a very sophisticated control of this craft if they were able to do those zigzag maneuvers. And yet, Lazar is saying that all this dumb crap was happening as well. There's also another problem with the Cash-Landrum connection, which is that Lazar is talking about plutonium, but in the context of gravity manipulation. So he's effectively saying that the Cash-Landrum craft and whatever craft is buried at Area 51 were using plutonium as an alternative to the alien fuel, element 115. Now, plutonium has been understood for decades, since World War II. And, it doesn't have any magical gravitational properties. So therefore, how can it act as the basis for any gravity manipulation system? Even if you have gravity amplifiers in, Lazar's sport model, it helps to increase the gravity effect from the element 115. Even then, where is the original gravity wave coming from? Because plutonium doesn't have that. So it cannot act as the basis for any gravitational manipulation system, even an inefficient and dirty one. From Alien Contact, Lazar says they were trying to use a normal nuclear reactor. Well, this is a contradiction again. So he's saying fueled with plutonium, and that was really a futile attempt. Well, but he just said that it actually flew, because in the Cash-Landrum case, it did fly, and it was being escorted by the helicopters. So it was at least flying. So how can it actually propel itself? Now he's saying normal nuclear reactor, maybe as you would find in a civilian nuclear reactor or a submarine or an aircraft carrier. That is therefore not a gravity, like it's not an engine which is using any sort of gravitational effect, because the plutonium doesn't have that property. So you can't amplify gravity waves from plutonium because it doesn't have them. So, this is just complete nonsense. Finally, a big fuck you. I'm sorry to say that, but Lazar is saying this actually to everybody, including his fans. He says, I feel like I really know what's going on and everyone's an idiot. He says, I really feel like I know what's going on, even though he also says that he's was heavily compartmentalized and he didn't know what was going on. He only got like a small picture of the entire, or the big picture. So, he doesn't know what's going on, and yet he knows what's going on. Okay, whatever. He says, everyone's an idiot. I really do feel that way. And I think this provides another clue about his motivations for this story, which is to feel smarter than other people. And he probably feels like really smart when he can trick gullible people who don't fact check anything with the story. And that's probably a big motivation for him, is just to feel, that he can get all this esteem and admiration from a group of people. But as I've just shown you, there's a ton of contradictions in his story. And that's about it. I'll probably make a follow-up to this video. I'm going to read his so-called autobiography and see whether he actually provides any more details about this stuff, but I'll make a follow-up. All right, guys, thanks. I hope that was helpful.